Jon Jones is one of those rare breeds of MMA fighters who has it all. He was simply born for this sport. Not only is he the greatest tactician we have ever seen in that he takes the fight where he is the strongest and the opponent is the weakest, but one thing that he does not get enough credit for is actually his athleticism, especially that of his strength. Now, Jon's physique is very deceptive. At first glance, you could never believe that a guy like this would be that strong, but as all of his opponents can testify, this was the case. He is freakishly strong. And the athletic gene certainly runs in the family as well, given that both of his brothers, Arthur and Chandler, were NFL players. But that is only half of the story. He also seeks out the right people for every aspect and actually reaches his athletic potential. Whether we're talking about his wrestling, jiu-jitsu, striking, or even his strength and conditioning, he has qualified personnel for nutrition, endurance training, swimming, and even strength training via powerlifting, which will be the main topic of this video. Jordan Chavez has been his strength training coach for many years, and one thing about this man is that he talks the talk and he walks the walk. Truly an exceptional coach, and above all with very rational arguments, which you will learn throughout this video. So in this video they are talking about how much Jon could lift in the big 3 competition lifts of powerlifting, and as you can see they are pretty big numbers. So based on all of the footage and information available, we can conclude that his estimated 1 repetition maximum in the big 3 lifts are the following. Now in the context of MMA, those numbers are probably far ahead of most UFC heavyweights out there, if not all of them. In powerlifting standards is pretty good too. I would rate him as an advanced or exceptional level powerlifter based on those numbers, probably not elite or world class, but we have to see the context here. Because again, Jon Jones is an MMA fighter, not a powerlifter. He trains with MMA, with grappling, with striking, he has different sessions, so his readiness will be less stable than if he had done powerlifting only. An elite powerlifter is only training 3 to 6 sessions per week. They will be perfectly recovered between sessions, they will be able to approach it more strategically, and they will have a lot of room for progression because their readiness, their fitness will not be as volatile as if they had done MMA also. Now one department where Jon Jones really excels at is the deadlift, and with his long arms, his physique is very appropriate for this exercise as well. Here he's performing a sumo variation at 600 pounds, which is really good, and he also performs some slightly elevated variations. For example, here he's performing an elevated deadlift at 635 pounds, which is super impressive for an MMA fighter. Again, keep in mind he's not a powerlifter, he's doing this as a supplement, and he's already hitting powerlifting-like numbers. And here he's performing some bench press, which his coach said that if Jon Jones had not been doing grappling or MMA aside from powerlifting and all of that, if he had put all of his focus on powerlifting, he definitely would have 405 pounds in him in the foreseeable future, which I absolutely believe. And the bench press is a no-brainer. It basically works on your horizontal pushing strength, which you will come across in many scenarios in MMA as well. So why did Jon Jones start powerlifting? For the simple reason that he wanted to get stronger. With his already exceptional skill set, he probably realized that his highest margin of improvement would be on the physical plane, which really paid dividends later in his fights as well. And the rationale as to how strength contributes to MMA is very simple. If the positioning and leverage are equal, which you will find yourself sometimes, the stronger athlete will have the advantage. That is very basic knowledge. Let's suppose you can squat 200 kilograms, a front squat for example. It is very likely that it will correlate with your ability to lift your opponent in a similar plane of movement, who may not only weigh half of that, but also have less strength than you. Here we can see him performing some heavy farmer's walks, and this exercise basically targets every single muscle of your body, head to toe. I assume this was part of his strength endurance session, for the lack of a better term, to make this MMA specific endurance under loaded and heavy conditions, and being able to handle that lactate buildup. By the looks of it, Jon Jones performs a lot of pull-ups with different variation. We have standard variations, weighted variation, he even does one-arm pull-ups, and different grip challenges. And pull-ups are basically used for pulling strength, upper body pulling that is, and it is very applicable to a lot of grappling scenarios in MMA. One thing you have to realize is that MMA is a mixed sport. You will have wrestling scenarios, striking and jiu-jitsu, so you need to be developed in all of them. The training that an MMA fighter goes through when it comes to strength and conditioning is very different to that of a boxer, for example. Now, a lot of people tend to get very caught up about injuries. They're afraid of getting injured, and exactly as Jon Chavez states here, it mostly stems from learning the incorrect technique, that you don't know what you are doing. And a lot of trainers out there, they are just not confident in their ability to teach the proper movement, to do the proper progression, so it becomes like a vicious circle. Provided that you have the fundamentals in the movement, you know, correct core tension, an equal amount of hip and knee flexion when you're doing deadlifts, being upright, having a neutral back, you are for the most part safe. You cannot be increasing at the expense of posture. It is that simple of a formula. And knowing this intuition of how much to increase, if you need to back down and all of those things, it comes with experience. Thousands after thousands hours of training and coaching, and to a large extent you cannot read about this, you just need the experience, and the more experienced you are as a coach, the more you can connect the dots. A lot of beginner lifters out there, they will be super obsessive about the correct repetition scheme or the correct program and all of those things, and by all means, yes, they are important, how you design your program. But what they seem to miss is that if your technique is suboptimal, no approach will be sustainable in the long term. Yes, you may gain some short-term strength, but in the end, you will have huge energy leaks, you will get injuries, you will get sprains. So you need to learn the proper fundamentals, and the best way to learn this is to work under someone experienced that has gone through it, done it all, connected the dots. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. When the form breaks down, an experienced coach or an athlete even, they will have to break down the causes. Is it a technique issue? Is it faulty muscular activation or stability? For example, are you engaging your glutes enough, your lats enough, your core enough? Or is it maybe of anatomical nature, such as a mobility issue? Do you have severe ankle mobility restrictions or lat mobility restrictions when you're doing the front squat? There is a lot of causes, and we need to identify those. And every case, every athlete is different when it comes to those things. Everyone will have an individual weakness that needs a special emphasis, and we cannot give a one-fits-all solution. And in this post they are talking about variety in training. For example, we have the 3 fundamental lifts such as the bench press, the back squat and the deadlift, but within those 3 big lifts there is further subcategories that you can implement to induce variation. For example, block bench presses, partial repetitions, repetitions with chains and bands, and different variations basically, because the body adapts to a specific training regimen over time and it needs change. And also the volume and intensity that they prescribe, this is done in accordance with his MMA. If they have an important event coming up or a tough training session, okay, they will be more conservative with the lifting. With that being said, here we have the umbrella term of the squat. And if we divide it into subcategories, we can see that there is a lot of variations to choose from. High bar back squat, low bar back squat, front squat, box squat, safety bar squat. It is never ending. And you are very privileged as an athlete because you can choose all of those variations. You know, when you get stuck, just change a couple of parameters and get back on the winning column. A lot of people are always moaning and crying about not progressing or getting stuck in plateau. Well, dude, if you stick to the same training regimen, of course you're not gonna progress. You need to change things up when one thing stops working. It is that simple. With time, the body accommodates to certain training formats. It adapts like a bacteria and it needs change to keep progressing. Because your body by default is not stupid. It wants to take the path of least resistance. It doesn't like putting forth more effort than it has to, but you need to tell your body, no, you have to adapt, you have to get stronger, because I want to win MMA matches, I want to get stronger, and you have to listen to this. And what we have gone through so far is just the variation in terms of changing exercise, but there is millions of other solutions. Okay, you can change the repetition range. If you've been doing 1 to 3, switch to 5 for a while. Rather than always maxing out your 1 repetition, try maxing out your 2 RM or 3 RM or 5 RM. Try pause variations, try partial repetitions. Maybe you're doing too many sessions after all, consider removing one. Or maybe you're doing too few sessions, consider adding one. Address weaknesses, for example, isolate glute exercises, alternate between partial overloaded repetitions such as full deadlifts one day and block deadlifts another day, use contrast methods, or maybe change your environment altogether. There is millions of solutions. And also Chavez talks about the importance of monitoring your training. Again, Jon Jones, he's not training for one sport in powerlifting, he's training for multiple sports in a certain sense, because MMA, it involves wrestling, it involves grappling and striking. In addition to that, he probably does endurance training, swimming and circuit training, and now he's doing powerlifting on top of all of this. Of course his fitness will be volatile. So if the MMA session, for instance, the day before was very tough and it left him fatigued and sore, they auto-regulate to this. They will be conservative with the volume for the next strength training session. In the other hand, was the MMA session manageable, leaving you fresh and recovered? Okay, then you can be more progressive with the volume for the next session. So they are always regulating based on his readiness, which has to be done in accordance to all previous workouts of that day or the day before or the days before. Again, in this post, they are talking about the variety of squats that they do, and he says they do box squats, they do pin squats, and even free squats. And periodically they will change between all of those to induce variation again. And within those categories of exercises, again, they will vary different bars, they will vary different positions from the bar, front squat versus back squat, they will vary the different depths on the box squat, they will vary the different depths on the pin squats. A whole bunch of variation basically, keep the body guessing, try different things and fight plateaus. And again, related to the previous point, they will also include variation for the bench press with different sticking points, for example board bench presses, partial repetitions and things of this nature. Normally how this is done, for example, you might go with full repetitions for a while, keep overloading with that for as long as it gives you results, and naturally results will start to decline and your body will plateau. Okay, then you go over to partial repetitions for a while and go at that for as long as it works. And then after that you might go back to your full range bench presses again or change to dead stop bench presses, just introduce a new variation. Exactly as his coach says, Jon does a good balance of different squatting variations and he is tremendously strong. He does everything from standard squats to Zercher squats, he even does box squats, he does high rep squats at 20 repetitions and even safety bar squats. There is a lot of variation that he does depending on what period he finds himself in. And why a squat? Well, it works on just that, your squatting strength, which is a combination of hip and knee flexion and extension, which is applicable to almost every single athletic maneuver out there, especially in a sport in MMA, when you're lifting your opponent, when you're defending a takedown. You need strong legs, you need strong hips, you need strong glutes, and this is what the squats target. It is one of the most fundamental movement patterns. And one of the variations that I have started to like a lot more recently is the Zercher squat, as you can see here. This is very applicable to wrestling scenarios, you know, when you pick your opponent up from a frontal plane. I just feel like this exercise was made for grappling. And here he argues why he chooses box squats, and the rationale for that is that it targets the hip more than the traditional squat because you can overload this aspect more and it's limited to one certain range of motion, and you can do with heavy enough intensities that you normally couldn't with regular squats, which means that not only will we be working with higher volume, higher intensity, but because it is limited to a certain range of motion, it will not induce as much soreness and fatigue, which will then affect future MMA sessions. And specifically he recommends a wider stance for the box squat because this targets the hips more, you know, the hip drive more than a regular squat, and he argues that this is an important aspect in MMA and combat sports in general. And with hip drive, I assume he's referring to hip extension, which of course is a very commonly occurring movement pattern in majority of MMA scenarios such as takedown attempts, defending a takedown, striking. And the muscle groups that are mainly responsible for this are the glutes. And there has indeed been some research that shows that wider stance squats targets the glutes better. In this post they are discussing sport-specific training, which at this point really has become a buzzword. What is this exactly? He argues that Jon has a special coach for everything, for MMA, for boxing, for striking and all of that. And he doesn't really need to give him a sort of half-assed approach where he does strength training and MMA technique combined in a hybrid manner. That's not gonna do anything good for any aspect. But how can we exactly define what sport specificity is? When most people think of sport-specific training, they think that you have to mimic the exact movements in the lifting room. They confuse complexity with efficiency, for example, attaching dumbbells to your ankles or throwing punches with weights or setting up some kind of weird mazes with Bosu balls and whatnot. This is a half-assed approach once again, and it doesn't really achieve anything worthwhile. You're not achieving better technical development in comparison to performing your sport in the first place. Instead, sport-specific training is really nothing complicated at all. It's about focusing on the compound lifts with progressive overload, fundamental movement patterns that you will experience in the sport, such as push, pull, squat, hip hinge, hip rotational power, those kind of things, introducing variation when plateaus do occur, and remaining attentive and tracking progress. Okay, you're super fatigued this day, then we have to adjust for the next session, or you had a tough MMA session today, okay, then we have to adjust that for the strength training session. It is about keeping it simple and focusing on the 20% of the actions that lead to 80% of the benefits. In countless of MMA facilities or sports teams in general, one coach or one personnel tries to take the role of multiple areas. In an optimal world, which obviously Jon Jones has, he has a qualified personnel for every single department. And then there will be no half-assed approach, everyone will stick to their expertise. And here he's performing some heavyweight rounds of sprinting. Pay attention to the arm swings as well. This is something that most people neglect. It's very important when sprinting. And this is basically used for development of explosive power and speed, and it targets the most powerful energy system in your body, namely the phosphagen system. Here we have some medicine ball slams, which is a subcategory of ballistic training, which is another method for explosive power development. The key here is to use a light enough ball so that you can express high power, high speed, so that you can recruit those motor units and work on your power development basically. The effort needs to be maximal intensity when you throw those balls, which is clearly evident by the video as well. And similarly here, he's working on hip rotational power with a sort of cable machine with a mace here. And the weight here again is manageable, just a little bit of resistance so that he can produce a lot of power and a lot of speed. Hip rotation basically. And here he's performing a broad jump, which is a subcategory of plyometrics for explosive power development, again with a special emphasis in the utilization of elastic energy. And I'm not sure how far this is, but it looks pretty far and he looks explosive doing it. As for conditioning, it appears that he's pretty enthusiastic about swimming, and swimming is generally regarded as a low impact method for conditioning, and given that Jon Jones probably trains multiple times a day with lifting and MMA and striking and wrestling and sparring, I assume that he wants to occasionally choose conservative methods as well for conditioning, which makes swimming an excellent alternative because it's low in impact. And again, related to the previous point, he argues that athletes already get an incredible amount of repetitions throwing punches or practicing double leg takedowns and all of that stuff. Do we really need to add those movements again in a strength training workout just to fit under the label of sport-specific training? It's better to just improve strength with fundamental compound movements, and this is what he is arguing for. A well-designed program should focus on exercises that counterbalance the demands of the sport, like strengthening the posterior chain, for example, the backside, because traditional strength training helps those athletes to develop the power to accelerate the strength and to decelerate effectively. He argues that it is pointless to have a car with incredible speed, which is comparable to throwing punches in this case, if it can't stop and decelerate, and this is what posterior work strength training does. In this post they are discussing his weight class shift, where he went up to heavyweight. What they basically did was to increase his training volume and caloric intake. In principle this sounds very simple, but it is actually very difficult to do. It is not easy to eat all the time, eat the right stuff, quality calories, quality stuff, increase training volume, train like a bodybuilder sort of to induce hypertrophy and time under tension. This is not easy. And he also argues that a lot of fighters, when they put on weight, they are impatient, they are in a rush and they fight perhaps too early and they are not used to having all of this new mass and they can't breathe even and they just shut down during the fight. But Jon, on the other hand, he was very patient with the process. So basically hypertrophy, obviously it's an increase in muscle size. It does not increase the muscle fibers per se, but increases the size of them. And the way this works is that you put your muscles under time under tension, you introduce micro trauma, and when the muscles recover they become bigger and come back stronger. And there are many ways of introducing hypertrophy. It can either be done by a very high intensity, but the most popular approach is probably high volume training, a more bodybuilding style, so to speak. A lot of sets, a lot of repetitions, high volume, get that micro trauma, get that time under tension, activate the protein synthesis. This is probably the most popular method. And of course, mass doesn't come from nowhere. You have to be very meticulous with what you eat, and you need to eat more calories than you usually do, because again, mass doesn't come from nowhere. It needs to come from something. And for this task, he began to work under Stan Efferding, a very competent nutritionist, world-class bodybuilder and powerlifter. He's often known as the world's strongest bodybuilder because he was just so strong in the powerlifting lifts as well. He previously worked with Brian Shaw and Hafthor Björnsson, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And basically they stuck to a caloric surplus, which is staying above the normal baseline, you know, to gain weight. They focused on quality calories for gaining muscles and not fat, so to speak. For about 1 pound of his body weight, they had 1 gram, so about 220 grams of protein per day, and half of that amount was fat. And then they increased his body weight from 240 pounds to 260 over several months with quality mass, muscle mass that is, predominantly at least. And they focused on minerals and electrolytes and a lot of potassium, which they got from mainly potatoes. And they essentially had 4 highly nutritious meals totaling 4,500 calories on training days. In days where intensity would be very high in the MMA sessions, they would stick to 4,500, and on lower fatigue days, they would stick to 4,000 to 4,250. Now, as he were moving up to heavyweight, he continued doing his heavy compound lifts, but in addition to that, he added a lot of bodybuilding style exercises, you know, a lot of accessories and isolated lifts, promote that time under tension, create that micro trauma so that your muscles can come back stronger, and really pave the way for hypertrophy and muscle growth, because he's moving up a weight class, and to a certain extent, he has to train like a bodybuilder for that. And here he is discussing that meanwhile he was gaining weight, he didn't change sport completely. He did not only train as a bodybuilder, which arguably a lot of fighters will do, but he stuck consistently with his MMA scheme as well. He did his jiu-jitsu, he did his wrestling and striking. This was simply an addition. He says that he was consistent from the first day to the last during this whole process. He says that outside of camp, even while gaining weight, he trained more than most fighters do in camp. And here he's discussing, again, fighters who want to gain some weight, what they have to do. And he's basically saying it's not easy. They exert a lot of energy in sports sessions, you know, you cannot be afraid of eating. You have to eat a lot, you have to plan it, you have to up your caloric intake, and you should not be afraid of food. You need to eat large meals if you're serious about gaining weight. It's just not easy. It requires a lot of planning.